Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 5. We're going to talk about an entire continent over the span of a very long period of time, and that is Africa. And we're going to talk about an entire religion over a very long span of time, and that is Islam. So we're going to cover a lot of space, a lot of geography, and a lot of time as briefly and succinctly as I can. So we'll start off with terms. The Quran, also spelled with a K, K-O-R-A-N, is the holy book of Islam. Now, it is considered infallible by adherents to Islam, much in the same way that the Bible is. Uh, Much like the Bible as well, the Quran wasn't actually written down until well after the death of the Prophet. And so there's an oral history that goes along with the Quran, and there had to be a kind of codification of the Quran. Now, the Quran, unlike the Bible, is not ordered chronologically. The Quran itself is ordered in importance of revelations, much like the Jewish Bible is, importance of revelations. It's not necessarily a chronological account. Some prophets in the Jewish Bible were given a little bit more weight than others were. And so some lessons were given a lot more weight than others. And same thing is happening in the Quran. Now, to companion with the Quran is the Hadith, stuff that isn't actually in the Quran and the revelations from God, but these are actually the traditions and sayings of the prophets. So if we are to take for real the revelations through Muhammad, he would have a unique insight to it. And so these are used to essentially inform legal matters and precedent and behavioral patterns and that sort of things. They're not given the same weight as the Quran. So if something the Hadith speaks about contradicts the Quran wins out. Shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe is a pre-contact sub-Saharan empire in the very south of Africa. And it was this massive trading empire. In fact, it was a confederacy of African city-states, much in the same way that you have the classic Greek period. Yeah, that'd be a good analogy. And Great Zimbabwe was the biggest and most cosmopolitan of all the city states, and so that entire society is named Great Zimbabwe. Now, unlike Egypt or Greece or Rome, this civilization was not known to most Europeans until the late 19th, early 20th century, where we can prove now it had a wide trading empire with Egypt and the Indian Ocean, so it had a very prominent role. Similar to Great Zimbabwe, but much more well known to Europeans, is the Mali Empire, which is actually a West African empire, one of many West African empires that arose in that period, predicated largely upon trade in salt, gold, exotics, and slaves. Excuse me. And so the Mali Empire had a wider connection to the rest of the world. And through that connection, it became a center of knowledge and learning. In fact, it became one of the most enlightened cities in the Muslim world, which was the most powerful, most enlightened society in the western part of the Eastern Hemisphere. So, in Africa, Southwest Asia, and even compared to Europe, the Muslim Empire was far more powerful, far more educated, far more articulate, and far more cosmopolitan than Europeans were at the same time, say about the 12th to the 13th and 14th centuries. So let's look at the origins and context of the rise of Islam and why it has a lot of the characteristics it does. And one of the best ways we can do that is by looking at the peninsula in which it arose, and that is the Arab Peninsula. Now, the Arab Peninsula is an exceedingly dry portion of the world. In fact, it receives less than 8 inches of rain a year. It has no real major rivers. Uh, about 2% of the land can sustain crops. Now, compare that to the United States, which is closer to 9% to 13% of the land can sustain crops. We tend to water our lawns and not grow crops. We theoretically could grow crops on our front lawns, but most of us don't. It's seen as gauche or maybe weird to do that. There's also frequent dust storms in the interior. The interior, as you see the smeary part in the center, is called the empty quarter, largely because it is a massive desert with very few instances of vegetation or water or anything like that. So this leads to massive dust storms. Anybody who's ever lived in a desert environment like Phoenix knows that dust storms happen. And also there's extreme temperature swings. In the summer, the average, and this is not the high, the average temperature is about 120 degrees during the day. And at night, in winter, it gets exceedingly cold. About 30 degrees is the average temperature at night. So why do deserts get cold? Well, deserts are just places where there's very little rainfall. It doesn't mean that they don't get cold. Deserts get cold, okay? So pre-Islamic society grows up in this harsh marginal environment. And as a result, it is largely a nomadic society, what is called Bedouin. The Bedouin culture is people following animals and moving from place to place, usually goats, moving from place to place in search of new water sources. Later on, they are introduced the camel from Asia. And the camel becomes an important part, but also horses are used in the more well-watered areas, particularly around where the oceans are, like the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Now, this leads to close-knit family groups that are associated into larger tribes. You have these close-knit family groups, extended families called the clans, and they are associated either through marriage or political convenience with other clans, and they form a tribe. And this is a very basic human organizational structure for societies, especially mobile, semi-nomadic, or even nomadic societies. And as a result of this, the society is largely illiterate. Now, this sounds pejorative, but it's not that they're unintelligent, and it's not that they don't hold on to history or they forget their history. They don't. There's a very deep oral history. In fact, there were people who grew up whose job was to remember things perfectly. And you can imagine if you are a young child and you go to learn the stories, the history of your people, and you're sitting at the knee of the man who's going to teach you, and it was almost invariably a man, and he has you recite the history that you learned yesterday. And if you're not perfect, you got to do it again, and you got to keep doing it until you get it perfect, until it's exactly what he told you. And the same thing happened to him, and the same thing happened to his teacher, and the same thing happened to the teacher of that teacher, and all the way back. So the oral history does retain a lot of the accuracy that written histories do. It wasn't until the later 20th century that oral histories really received the seriousness that they kind of deserve. There was this prejudiced belief that written histories were more accurate than oral histories were, and Socrates would argue with that. He would say that writing all these things down is creating people's forgetfulness. It's cultivating forgetfulness. And it turns out that when people write things down, they also lie. They lie to themselves. You lie in your diary. You're never really totally completely honest. Like, I cut that guy off and he totally deserved to lay on the horn at me and scream at me because I was being a jerk. But, no, most of the time it's like, oh, that guy was a jerk and, he tried to get in front of me and so I wouldn't let him and all that sort of stuff. So we tend to lie to ourselves. We lie to history. And we do that when we write things down as much as when we remember. So Bedouin traditions, because it's a family network, there's this system, and it's not a very perfect system, and idealized, it would be to protect the family and to protect your honor, because if you are moving around, you don't have things to protect. For instance, property. You don't have a big house. You don't have books or or a lot of nice clothes or things like that. Now, there are very rich people within these families, of course, and there are very poor people within these families. But there is this kind of interdependence, and the very nature of your society, the very nature of your movement, and the very nature of your geography means that at any moment you could go from being the strongest to the weakest, or vice versa. For example, you could be struck with an illness. And so there's this idea of caring for your weakest family members and looking out for them. And this also can lead to some very violent altercations between not just tribes, but within clans as well. The so-called blood feud, which still kind of permeates a little bit of uh, Arab culture, but it also permeates other cultures as well. We can think of the Hatfield and McCoys here in the United States. There was this kind of blood feud that went on for generations where the two hated each other, right? And that is largely because of a breakdown or a lack of social structure, a lack of like an independent body that takes care of laws and enforcing laws. So if somebody steals something from you in, let's say, England, you can appeal to the sheriff, and the sheriff sends out somebody to go find that person and arrest them and get your stuff back, put them on trial. And that sheriff is disinterested. It's not his things that are stolen, he's just enforcing the law. If there is no overarching government, if there is no overarching system of justice, this leads to very Mad Max post-apocalyptic kind of revenge scenarios. So somebody steals something from you, you go not only take it back, but then you steal something from them. And then, of course, they get mad, so they come after you and they steal their stuff back, plus the stuff that they originally stole, and then they hurt somebody while doing it. Well, now they've hurt somebody, and then we go and and so you can see how it kind of escalates and eventually gets to killing of each other. And it continues along for generations or for years at the very least, and can become extremely bloody. One of the things that you can absolutely guarantee people will fight over is, of course, water. Water is arguably the most important resource next to air for human survival, and only slightly ahead of food. Those three things are going to ensure that you have some kind of fight on your hand if you try to monopolize those. So controlling water is controlling life. And the mythology of pre-Arab Bedouins reflects a lot of this. There are a multitude of gods and spirits. There is one major god, known as the God or Allah, who puts things in motion. He puts things in place. And then there are minor spirits, things like jinn and some monsters like ghouls and things like that roam the desert and wreak havoc upon humans. There are some religions that do permeate this Bedouin culture. For instance, there was a very devout Jewish tribe, and there still was until the later 20th century, of devout Jews living in places like Yemen and Oman and other parts of the Arab Peninsula. Um, there was also some Christianity filtered in, some of it coming from Ethiopia, some of it coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. There's also a religion called Zoroastrianism, which is a kind of dualist religion. There's a good god and an evil god, and they're locked in an eternal battle between each other, and they're roughly equal to each other. And that battle plays out in human souls, that you have that evil impulse and the good impulse. You can think about the angel and devil on your shoulders. That's a very Zoroastrian kind of look at the way the universe is. You're always tugged between doing the good thing and doing the evil thing, and it's our decisions that affect the course of that battle between the two gods. And so you have this Zoroastrian, which filters in. So you've got other religions besides this traditional kind of um, animist religion. There are pre-Islamic cities. In fact, there are several little kingdoms along the coastlines where there is, in general, more rainfall and there's cooler temperatures. And of course, there's access to trade routes via the sea. And they are equally culturally diverse. You would have pagan religions, you have Jewish religions, or Jewish cities, you have Christian cities, you have Zoroastrian cities. And they are tend to be subject to invasion. Sometimes they were taken over by Ethiopia, for example. Ethiopia did invade the Arab Peninsula. The Romans took over, the Persians took over, and so there's a lot of influence from other societies. And we can see that actually in the Quran, where Alexander the Great is obliquely referenced in Persian in the Persian history, Alexander the Great is not seen as the Great because he came in and destroyed a bunch of cities and he ruined an entire civilization. Why? Well, just because he's kind of a warmonger, right? So he is often referred to, if you're being charitable, as Alexander the Macedonian, or if you're being a little bit more realist, or if you're being a little bit more dramatic, you refer to him as Alexander the Two-Horned One. He has two horns under his hair, and he is a devil, right? And so the name for Alexander in Persian became Zul-Qarnayn. It means the two-horned one. And so that name crops up in the Quran, but in a very positive light. So they're taking this negative name and turning it into a positive light, and that it was God who gave Alexander the power to conquer the world because he was trying to save the world from devils, these devils that live in the north called the Gog and the Magog. They are these ice devils, essentially, that are going to try to destroy the world. And so Alexander is given all this power. And it's really, really interesting to see the treatment of Alexander in Islam. Now, two of the major cities I'm going to look at, and there are a lot of city-states, there are two major cities that play key roles in the development of Islam. First is Mecca. Mecca is a center for trade in the eastern part of the peninsula. In fact, they've got this whole kind of tourism trap vibe going on. And although Mecca itself is actually further inland and they rely on a seaport a little ways down the road, it does become a center of trade. And so they have a lot of idols and a lot of gods and a lot of shrines placed in Mecca. So that you would have Indian traders or you would have Persian traders or Romans or Great Zimbabwe would come. And of course, you want to say something to your gods to make sure that you get home okay. You say a little prayer, leave a little offering, that sort of thing. And of course, as caretakers of these shrines and also being the merchants who sell you the goods, the people who ran Mecca made a fairly tidy profit. And the people who ran Mecca was a tribe called the Qurayshi tribe. And so they become extremely wealthy. They're getting a lot of money from trade, from being intermediaries, from being middlemen, and also from being the guardians of these shrines. And so it's in their interest to protect trade routes. And that's how they really kind of exert their control. Now, the other city is a little further north along the peninsula. It's called Medina. We're going to call it Medina. Its actual name is Yathrib, kind of an archaic name. It's now known as Medina, and I'll get to why in a little bit here. So we're going to call it Medina. It is largely a farming community. It has no real access to the ocean except through trade routes, and it has relatively reliable rainfall. It's relatively lush compared to the rest of the peninsula, so it's a very successful farming city. Not that it doesn't have its own wealth and its own peoples governing the city. It does, but it's not nearly as wealthy or as successful as Mecca. In fact, it relies on Mecca to kind of trade goods for food. So they would get food, their trading partners would get food, and Medina would get metals or silks or salt or whatever, right? And the other difference between Mecca and Medina had a coalition of tribes that tried to run the city, and they were often at odds with each other. There was differences in religion, differences in tribe mentalities, difference in priorities, that sort of thing. So it was sometimes mismanaged. Now, into this mix, into this larger society, is born a young man, the man named Muhammad. And Muhammad was a an orphan. He was raised by his uncle, or I'm sorry, his grandfather. He was raised by his grandfather, and at the tender age of 9, he was apprenticed to a merchant. It's kind of like getting your MBA when you're 9. So he grows up in this merchant culture of trading all along the different routes, particularly land routes going into the Eastern Mediterranean, and he garners this reputation of being an extremely honest merchant who always kept his word. And this gives him this kind of stellar reputation where he becomes a kind of a celebrity. He is the most admired man. You can think of somebody like, I guess, like Warren Buffett, who has a lot of money but is also very principled, or something like that. And he was troubled by the way he saw Meccan society carried out. Meccan society began to favor, because it was more settled and not as traditional, it became more wealthy and it became more comfortable to live there, and people became more jealously guarding of their treasures and of their position and of their money. And so a lot of people in Mecca society, particularly the elderly, the sick, the poor, the orphans, they were seen as parasites upon society, and they were treated very, very poorly. And so he would seek refuge outside of the city. And it is during one of these meditations upon the injustice of the world that allegedly an archangel, Gabriel, came and visited Muhammad and gave him the first revelation of the Quran, the revelation of Islam. Islam means to surrender to God. And the story goes that he's in this cave, he feels a presence, and suddenly that presence grabs him and squeezes him really tight and tells him, recite. And he's like, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean? Recite what? And it squeezes him tighter. And it says, recite again. And he's getting to the point where he can't breathe. And then eventually the revelation comes to him that there is no God but God. There are not a multiplicity of gods. There is only one. And with that revelation, when he speaks it out loud, la ila Allah, then he is dropped by the presence. The presence leaves the cave. He runs home, thinks it's one of these crazy spirits out there, genies or something like that, who are trying to make him go insane. His wife, Khadijah, who is this incredible romantic love he has, she is about 20 years his senior. She is very wealthy. She is very powerful. She is very well connected herself. And she happens to have a cousin who is the equivalent of a comparative religions professor. He's well versed in Jewish and Christian gospels and monotheistic faiths. And so they speak to this cousin, and the cousin confirms that Muhammad's revelations are consistent with what happens in the Bible. The sense of presence, the sense of being crushed by this other presence, the sudden words just flowing out of you as if you were a conduit, that these are legitimate biblical style revelations. And so Muhammad stops being a merchant and begins to preach this new monotheistic religion in Mecca. So he begins to walk around Mecca saying, there is no God but the one God. There is only one. All the rest are trash. All the rest are delusions. All the rest are nonsense. Do you think this might cause a problem for him in Mecca? If you said yes, then you bang on. Of course, their money is tied into the trade in gods. Their money is tied into people coming to Mecca because that is the place where you can make an offering to your gods. So you might as well do some trading there. And if there's a guy running around saying all these gods are false, let's destroy these idols, that's a problem. That's an impinging upon their wealth. And the prophet had been invited during his rant, and this takes a while after a couple of years of not very great success of converting people to Islam in Mecca. Mostly the poor, the slaves, the suffering are the ones who flock to this religion. But his reputation for honesty and wisdom does precede him, and he's invited to Medina to basically be an adjudicator. He would resolve disputes between these different tribes. Initially, he turned down the offer, but after his uncle, who was the head of his tribe, died, the Prophet Muhammad had no protection. And so he flees to Medina. That's where it gets its name. The full name is Medina al-Rasul, which is the city of the Prophet. So upon his arrival, Muhammad begins to change the message of the Quran from a purely spiritual one, and a lot of the revelations kind of follow this, into a more religio-political, social contract. So a lot of the practices initially are patterned after Jewish practices. So a good example would be the Day of Atonement, what is known as Ramadan, was just a period, a few days of atonement that happened to fall on Yom Kippur. So it was very much like Judaism. They prayed toward Jerusalem rather than anywhere else because Jerusalem was considered the holiest city. And Muhammad even tried to trace the lineage of the Arabs back to Hagar and Ishmael. And in that, he kind of upset Jewish tribes who said, "Oh, no, 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 no. There's none of this co-opting our religion for your religion. Nope, that doesn't work for us." So he had a bit of trouble with Jews, with the Jewish tribes in Medina. And no, this does not lead to why Muslims hate Jews. No, that absolutely does not lead that way. In fact, up until the 20th century, Muslims and Jews saw themselves as brothers being oppressed by the other Abrahamic religion, and that is Christianity. Yeah. So during his time in Medina, he does attract more followers. He gets hundreds and thousands of followers, and he eventually becomes kind of the de facto leader of Medina. But here's the problem. A lot of the people who came with him from Mecca had no experience farming. Like if you dropped me in the middle of a farm and told me to go out in the field and work, I would have no idea what the heck I'm doing, right? So he needed to come up with a way to deal with the added strain of people in Medina, as well as articulate certain rules on how to be a good Muslim for those people who join him while in Medina. And this leads to what would later be known as the five pillars, which is kind of the central tenets of Islam. And these are really not articulated very well until throughout the arc of the religion, but they boil down to the five big pieces of becoming a Muslim during Muhammad's time, and do form the backbone of what it means to become a Muslim. Now, first, you have to acknowledge that there is no other God than God. And Muhammad is his messenger. He is a prophet, right? So, la illa Allah wa Muhammadur Rasul Allah. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. A good Muslim prays 5 times a day facing the direction of the holy city. Initially, while he's in Medina, that holy city is Jerusalem. There are some political considerations and some betrayals that happen that eventually change that to eventually Mecca. A good Muslim must always give alms to the poor, and that means giving charitably. Don't think about how much you're giving, just think about the need that they have. So a good Muslim will donate whatever they can, the kind of Christian charity of giving, not letting the left hand know what the right hand is doing when you're giving. So you give abundantly. This also reflects during Ramadan when you're supposed to fast during daylight hours, and then in the evening you can eat, but also it's expected that you put out food for beggars and for poor people. So that's one of the ways that you give alms to the poor. A good Muslim must fast at the appointed time. That is, eventually becomes the month of Ramadan. And a good Muslim must make a pilgrimage, and this is the last to be added, and this comes at the very end of Muhammad's life, and actually comes in reaction to his death in Mecca. Must make a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in their life if they are able to. If you're poor and you can't make it, it's not like you're going to be barred from heaven if you can't make it. God knows all. God knows that you wanted to go to Mecca. God knows you wanted to go to the holy city, but you couldn't. Physically or economically or situationally, you just couldn't. And so these five pillars give kind of, well, initially they're four pillars and they become a fifth after the death of the prophet. So these pillars give you a fast, down and dirty guide to becoming a Muslim, which is much less complex than becoming a Jew. In many tribes, becoming a Jew means you have to marry into a Jewish tribe, and then your children become Jewish. You don't become Jewish. You can practice Judaism, but you're not a Jew. Your children do because your wife gave birth to these children. By the same token, if you are to become a Christian, there's a lot of different stories floating around about what it means to become a true Christian. So there are very complex ways to become a Jew or a Christian, very simple ways to become a Muslim. So long story short, eventually Muhammad does return to Mecca. The Qurayshi tribe eventually capitulates to Muhammad for a variety of reasons, and he becomes known as the prophet and the holy man of this uniting religion. The first time in Bedouin Arab history that there was a single uniting religion. Unfortunately, a year after the Prophet, or after Muhammad returns to Mecca, he dies. And he dies at a relatively young age of 60. And because he preached that Islam was the last chance God was giving to humans to get their act together and worship him properly, there are no divinely guided people who will come after him. And so questions arise about who will rule in Muhammad's place, who will govern the Arab people, and also who will put down rebellions, because there were people who pledged to become Muslim only while the Prophet was alive, and then once he was dead, they're like, well, my promise to him is over, we're cutting ties, and of course, that doesn't really sit well with religions. You say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and leave. That doesn't sit well, especially because the people who still adhered to Islam argued that you made a promise to God, not to the prophet, and so there's a rebellion. And so the tribes get together and they form a kind of parliament, and they have this open discussion, and they eventually name a successor. The successor is given the title Khalif Rasul Allah, means the successor to the messenger of God. Khalif Rasul Allah. The chosen successor then leads the Bedouin people, or leads the Muslim followers into putting down the rebellion and also expanding the territory of Islam, essentially incorporating other tribes, whether they're Jewish or Christian or pagan or Zoroastrian, into the broader community. Now, the four leaders of the Muslim world who emerge after the death of the Prophet are often referred to as the Rashidun, the four rightly guided caliphs. They knew the Prophet during his lifetime. And so they had a lot of similar touchstones and a lot of similar points of view. And the caliphs had this job of not only cobbling together the Bedouin society, this Arab society, but also now they had these guys who were ready and raring for war, and there were big societies outside of the Arab Peninsula that begged, essentially, in their minds, to be converted to Islam. And so there's this reputation that Islam gets that it conquered its way through the world. And that is partly true, much the same way that Christianity conquered its way through Europe and then later on the rest of the world. That is partly true. The other half of that is that it also was spread through missionaries, not any appointed missionaries, but self-appointed missionaries who would go out and wander and spread the word of Islam. For example, the Arab Caliphate does take on the big Persian Empire, the Sasanian Empire, and causes it to collapse. I mean, just absolutely just makes it fold like a house of cards and spreads Islam via the sword into the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, all along North Africa, and even into Spain by about the 700s. So within 150 years of the Prophet's death, we have this massive culture that is largely conquered. But there are parts of the world that the conquest never reached, yet Islam does as well. A good example of that is China and India. The Muslim conquerors never really make it that far. They kind of hit the limit of where they can go. So this gives you an idea of how Islam spread. As you can see, some of it spread back into the peninsula as well. So within about 150 years, this is what the Muslim world looks like. It's got the southern part of the Mediterranean, it's got Spain, it's got a large chunk of what would later become Afghanistan, Persia, Iraq, Syria, and the Arab Peninsula. During these conquests, during this period, the Rashidun period, there comes a division within Islam, and it's largely predicated not on religious interpretation, well, kind of on religious interpretation, but on the issue of succession. And I mentioned before that we have the caliph is elected by an advisory body called the Shura Council. It's kind of a parliament, right? Well, there were some who believed that the prophet had holy blood, that his blood was sacred, or his lineage was sacred. And so the person who should be leading the uh, the community of the faithful are people who are related to him or can draw lineage to him. And one of these people is his nephew and also son-in-law, a man named Ali. Now, this division was kind of put on the back burner for a couple of leaders, and then when it came to the fourth leader, Ali was eventually chosen, but Ali was assassinated. And the entire Rashidun Caliphate, these rightly guided prophets, that ends and a new caliphate, a new dynasty arises, right? Um, the division comes from that particular assassination, and actually a little bit before that. The Shia, also known as Shiat Ali, the Shia are known as the Party of Ali. They are a minority of Muslims. They are ballparking about 10% at any given period. About 10% of the Muslims, and they venerate Ali and his son Hussein, and his other son Hassan, but less so because Hussein's the older. And they believe that the caliph could only be from the line of the prophet. And they have this loose interpretation. They have a very different interpretation that evolves over time of the Quran. Now, the majority of Muslims are what are known as Sunni. Sunni Muslims, about 80, 85% of Muslims at any given time. Um, these are the majority, and it derives from the term sunnah, which means the path or the actions of the prophet during his lifetime, which is different from the hadith, which is the sayings of the prophet, but that's a little bit more complex. And according to them, according to the Sunni, the caliph should be chosen from amongst the body politic, from amongst what is known as the ummah, the community. In theory, anybody can lead the 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 community of the faithful. Anybody can become caliph. A young woman could theoretically become caliph. In practice, it usually doesn't work out that way. And typically, they have a much more stringent interpretation of the Quran, particularly this issue of whether you can portray the prophet or not, whether you can draw the prophet or display human beings in general. That is considered iconoclastic. The Shia, a little bit more loose in their interpretation. They don't show the face of the prophet. Instead, there's like this kind of sunburst, and the rest of his body is shown, so you're not really seeing his face. There's a whole reason behind that, largely so that you don't distract yourself from worshiping God, that you get stuck up on what God might look like rather than the theory and the knowledge of God, this kind of abstract concept, because God is beyond your ability, your human mind to conceive. Like, what would God look like? Nope, can't do it because you have no concept whatsoever, right? It's like asking a bacteria what the body upon which it lives looks like, right? So it's absolutely impossible. And one of the things that arises with Islam is this concept of jihad. Now, jihad is literally means to struggle, and a lesser jihad is to struggle against somebody externally. And according to the Prophet in the Quran and in the Hadith, the greater jihad is to struggle within yourself to do the right thing, to be a better person. But there is an attraction to the lesser jihad of struggling against unbelievers. So that caliphate that I was talking about that takes over after the four Rashidun, they begin to, after the collapse of the Persian Empire, they begin to take on the Byzantines and they attack Constantinople. Constantinople is able to fend them off because of a couple of inventions. One, it has extremely thick walls. The walls are reputed to be so thick that you can drive three chariots side by side along the top of the wall and still have room. So it's like a highway, essentially. It's really, really thick. And also they have this thing called Greek fire, which is similar to napalm, although we don't know the composition completely because the recipe's been lost. So they're using some pretty scary technology to keep their city relatively safe. That doesn't stop them from losing territory, and so the majority Sunni caliphate, it takes more and more territory, and as they take more territory, they take spoils, and that spoils was distributed evenly amongst the community of believers. Constantinople, for its own part, is already at odds with the Western Roman Church. So they're not really on speaking terms, at least not until the end of the 11th century when things become extremely dire and we get the beginning of the Crusades. Constantinople sometimes defeats, sometimes bribes the Umayyads to go away, this early dynastic caliphate. And the Umayyads, this early caliphate, does some innovative things. First, they're extremely brutal in their leadership. They put down rebellions pretty quickly and are willing to step on the necks of people who are getting uppity. But they do make Arabic the official language of court and administration, and it is during this time that the Quran is actually written down in classic Arabic. They issued standardized coins, which promotes trade across the Mediterranean and into the Middle East. They also streamlined tax codes. Remember, they're inheriting a bunch of different tax codes from the Byzantines and the Persians and the Egyptians and a bunch of other societies. Then they streamline it. They institute tax reform, if you will. Okay, and so they have these different levels of taxes, some of which people are immune to, and some of which everybody has to pay. And of course, they also built the most important mosque, or I would say third most important mosque in Islam, and that is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. It harkens back to the life of the Prophet, and I'm not going to go ahead and get into it just now. The Umayyads eventually do overstep. They are incredibly corrupt, and that corruption catches up to them, and there's an unsettling. On top of that, the conquests are slowing. They're reaching the limits of their power, which is admittedly fairly large, but you can only stretch so long in a pre-modern period, or even in a modern period. And so that flood of loot begins to dry up, and so you're not bribing the followers, the community of believers as much. And so this sets up a bunch of rebellions, including what would later be known as the Assassins, the Hashashin, which is a secret society. And eventually the Umayyads are overthrown about 747 AD. Muslim armies after that period become a little less interested in expanding into Europe, particularly after the defeat in Poitiers and some of the other defeats that they've had. And so they become very kind of more about internal infrastructure and building up the society. The successor dynasty, known as the Abbasids, they begin to focus on piety, on building mosques, and they also focus on learning. And it's this combination of Quranic teachings and philosophical learnings that they believe would guard against corruption and laziness and greed. The Abbasids go on to form this city that initially was just a tiny little trading town called Baghdad. Becomes a center of wealth, luxury, and education. And the city is built upon a grand plan. There's two concentric rings, an inner city and an outer city. And between both of them runs the Tigris River, the one that's further east. And the city is this kind of like shining beacon of not only city planning, but architecture, art, learning, and domestic harmony. It eventually becomes a center of learning as this grand library is opened called Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. The House of Wisdom becomes this linguistic library in about the early ninth century. And initially, they focused on translating between different societies' learnings into Arabic and Arabic into these different societies' learnings. And so they gathered a lot of the works of the ancient Greeks, for example. So Euclid, Galen, Plato, Hippocrates, Pythagoras, Aristotle. And they also gathered philosophies from India and China. A good example of this is Shushustra. Uh, the I think one of the crowning achievements is this Persian uh, mathematician who quantified. Now, I have down here he has invented algebra. He quantifies algebra and makes it more rigorous and more uh, formally understood, as well as introducing what are known as, to the Arabs, Indian numerals, what we call Arabic numerals. The number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0, which is sifr, which is where we get the word cipher from. And cipher is actually just a concept of a zero. Prior to this, especially in Europe, you didn't have that ease of mathematical equations. So it's this combination of these two things that Al-Khwarizmi basically solidifies algebra as a way to solve problems without actually having all of the answers or all the components of the problems. There were also other ways that Muslims kind of spotlit, or sorry, not spotlit, Muslims kind of approached thinking in a very innovative way, and one of those is medicine. One of the first true hospitals was founded in Baghdad in 850. I'm sorry, not 850, 870 of the current era. And it was a melding of Greek, Roman, Indian, and Chinese medical practices. They kind of pick and choose the ones that worked the best. And one of the most amazing ones is the theory that something in the blood carried smallpox, measles, and a couple of other diseases. And although they couldn't prove it because they didn't have microscopes to be able to see the little pathogens in there, they were onto something. And eventually they also began to immunize people and that sort of thing, and I won't quite get into that. They also innovated on uh, understanding the human body, how blood moves around in the body, using the pulse and the circulatory system uh, to diagnose whether somebody is ill or injured or something like that. Also, the belief that diseases could be carried through water, and so they also instituted standards for clean water, ways to purify water. One of the ways that they did to purify water was to run it through copper, or have it sit in a copper tub. And one of the great things about copper is it is a natural antimicrobial surface. Things die when they touch copper. So there you go. And one of the coolest ones, a little on the squeamish side, so if you're not quite sure, you might want to turn away on this one. Facial reconstruction surgery. In an era where there are swords and there are very sharp things, and you tend to get into fights, the tendency of your nose to get cut off was alarmingly common. So that was one of the things that happened to people a lot. And so rather than walk around with a big gaping hole on your face, they wanted to reconstruct your face. They would put wooden tubes in your nostrils to act as the kind of framework, and then they would cut a little pattern off the top of your forehead, and then they would turn it around and flip it over so that the part that was red and juicy and had a lot of the capillaries was up against your face, and then they would secure that against your face to make a new nose. And they had self-dissolving sutures, and this is amazing. They would take biting ants. They would take biting ants, they would pick them up with tweezers, and they would put them right up against where the new flesh was to be grafted onto the face. Of course, the ant would bite, and then they would immediately pinch the head off so that the head remained and the body was detached. This, of course, killed the ant, and the ant would remain pinched down. So it became a suture, would hold it in place. And they kept doing that all along your face until it was secured. Over time, of course, because you have a dead ant head on your face, it eventually rotted away. But by the time it rotted away and dissolved, your new nose, was good as new. So that's a pretty cool. And I want to say how tough our ancestors were. They had no anesthetics. I mean, yeah, you'd get a little bit of poppy milk or maybe a little bit of hashish dissolved in milk, but no Vicodin, no Demerol, nothing like that. And so the influence of Islam spreads, and it begins to spread, and it adapts to local traditions and customs, just like all the other religions we've looked at. When we look at Buddhism or Christianity or whatever, they begin to change and they adopt their customs. So there are some non or even pre-Islamic practices which continue under Islam. A good example of this would be the veiling of women. In the Quran, it only says that men and women should dress modestly and that they should do everything they can to try to not provoke arousal in the opposite sex, right? There's nothing in it that says the face has to be covered. There's nothing in it that says that the body must be completely covered under some massive flippin' tent. Nothing like that. That actually comes from the Athenians and the Byzantines. The Athenian tradition of veiling your woman, your highborn woman, so that others wouldn't look enviously upon her, was adopted by the Byzantines. The Byzantines also veiled their very well-born, their very secluded women who were more property than anything else. And of course, when the Muslims started conquering Byzantine territory and they took brides, particularly wealthy brides, that tradition flowed and it became kind of an unofficial thing. And so that eventually is incorporated into Islam. Islam spreads a unified language throughout Africa and Eurasia, which increases trade opportunities, increases cultural and linguistic ties, and makes travel across the world actually way easier than it had been in prior periods. A good example of this would be a man named Ibn Battuta. I'm going to go ahead and skip over this one because we're running short on time here. Uh, so Ibn Battuta is a young man. He takes off on his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca, and it becomes instead a rihla, which is a massive voyage, a big journey. How big is it? Well, Ibn Battuta's travels are shown here in green. He starts off in Morocco, which is on the far western portion of North Africa, and travels as far as China, Russia, into the Mali Empire. He even visits some of the Swahili successor states to Great Zimbabwe. All told, he travels some 32,000 miles, or 50% further than Marco Polo did. Marco Polo's journey, also epic, shown there in red to compare the two. So, all right, so we're going to really kind of fast forward through this because I think I took a little bit too long on Islam. But Africa has a lot of problems facing us when we try to study it. Size-wise, Africa as a continent is enormous. You could fit all of China, all of the United States, and all of Europe into Africa. That's how much land space there is. So to say there is one African culture, to say that there is one African language is incredibly disingenuous. It is incredibly simplistic. We'll go ahead and give you an idea just how big it is. The Sahara Desert, which is the northernmost desert in Africa, is actually bigger than the continental United States in itself. It is over 3,200 square miles, could swallow the entire 48 states, and it grows about half a kilometer a year. So it is an enormous, enormous desert. There are also a lot of different languages and a lot of different cultures. And here we have a breakdown of the different language families. That's not languages, language families, much like English and Italian are technically Indo-European, but they're not mutually intelligible. Or Swedish and Persian are Indo-European, but not mutually intelligible, right? So we have these different language families. To give you an idea, there are 18 different language families in Africa alone. And there's a variety of climates, terrains, and biomes. It's not all just a jungle. Usually that's a very central Western African kind of look. There's savannas, there's mountains, there's lush areas, there's desert areas, there's all sorts of areas in Africa. So to say that it's all one type, if you imagine Africa and you see the Serengeti, that's actually just East Africa. East Africa is largely like that, but not all of East Africa. There are some other barriers to us understanding Africa. They're largely illiterate societies. Again, that doesn't mean ignorant. And most of the commentaries are provided by outside societies, so Muslim or Arab traders, and later on European and Christian traders. So we have to be very careful about the way we process a lot of this information and the way that we understand Africa. There are a number of erroneous assumptions. For instance, African societies remained in the Stone Age, and this is a prevalent theory even today, thanks in large part to what is known as poverty porn. Essentially, those late night appeals to help support third world countries where they show people covered in flies, with distended bellies, with like old shirts and stuff like that. Yes, there is poverty in Africa. Absolutely. It is amongst the poorest continents on the planet in sense of per capita. But there's also very affluent, very well off societies, and not just South Africa and not just Egypt, but Nigeria, Kenya, and Cote d'Ivory. There's a lot of societies that are doing fairly well, and yeah, they deal with a lot of problems, but they're not all living in the Stone Age. And this is also a throwback to 19th century imperialism. There's also this belief that Africans were associated in tribal societies and they had no real empires or kingdoms. And that, of course, in Africa, Egypt is the exception to the rule. And that's just not true. It absolutely is not true. Just because we don't have a written record of it from contemporaries doesn't mean it didn't happen. So what can we glean? Well, let's go ahead and skip over a couple of these. So there we are. Okay, so Sub-Saharan Africa was for a long time referred to as Sudan. Sudan is actually a derivative of an Arabic word meaning black person. Aswud means black. Sudan means the land of black people. And so anything that was south of the Sahara Desert was referred to as the land of very black people. And it differentiates between Mediterranean Africans or Asiatic Africans and those who are sub-Saharan. And this comes from about the 7th century CE when Muslim traders begin to take over some of these lucrative trade routes that go through the Sahara Desert. And trade has a really deep effect on sub-Saharan culture. There are a lot of gold mines and salt mines, and particularly slave trading, which happens. One of the things that we have to be very careful of when we talk about slave trading is that a lot of times these slaves were from conquered people, and they were excess populations because there were in sub-Saharan societies, particularly those who abut the Sahara, there are some marginal areas. And so sometimes you would have excess people. And so those excess people would be either captured or they would be imprisoned for some reason. And then, of course, one of the ways you can get rid of them is to exile them. And why not make some money on it, right? But that's not to say that that these these slaves were destined for, like, say, the West Indies, as they would be in the 19th century. In the classic period and in the medieval period, some slaves, yes, absolutely worked like salt mines or fields or very menial labor, but some also became tutors, they became advisors, and they eventually became power brokers themselves. This leads to a standard of living that increases in West Africa and leads to the rise of the so-called Mali Empire. The Mali Empire is this very powerful kind of militaristic empire that arises out of control of trade routes as well as military monopoly. The height of the Mali Empire saw two major cities, Timbuktu and Jen, which were built to serve different roles within the Mali Empire. Timbuktu becomes kind of the center for learning and the arts and architecture within not just Africa, but the wider Muslim world. They attracted a lot of people to come and learn there, to live there. And so Islam becomes more and more infiltrated into sub-Saharan Africa. In Jen, the focus on learning the Quran and learning jurisprudence also pays off as well. This leads to a lot of people coming to the Mali Empire. And an example of this would be the construction of the Jingabeir Mosque. The Jingabeir Mosque is a massive mud and fired brick construction, and it seems kind of underwhelming from these pictures. It's actually incredibly breathtaking, especially because it is one of the largest structures built, single-purpose structures built in sub-Saharan Africa until the 19th century, and that is it is meant to be a mosque. And it has the capacity for up to 2,000 people at a single time. In case you don't know how big that is, if you were to go into a classroom at Thomas More College, you'd probably see about 20 people in the class, right? So just explode that by 100 different classes, right? A good example of that would also be a modern church would hold probably 900 to 1,000, right? So it's pretty large. And on top of it, the mud brick helps keep the interior cool during the heat of the summer, and and also retains heat when it gets cold at night. So it's actually an early form of air conditioning. Um, the Mali adopt this Sunni Islam interpretation, but Islam is largely confined to the cities, the merchant class, and the elites to whom literacy and trade are important. The penetration of Islam into the countryside is kind of hit and miss, uh, largely through scattered tribes, and because of the relatively stable society, those older beliefs don't really go away very quickly, and they kind of prevent the spread of Islam. The Milanese have this massive, massive empire, twice as large as the previous empires, and they have a lot of money coming in. Mali is written of in contemporary Muslim texts as far away as Persia, Iran, I'm sorry, not Iran, Iraq, and Mecca as well. How how powerful and how rich were these West Africans after all? I mean, they're Africa, right? Aren't isn't that the place we send our spare shoes and glasses and Super Bowl loser jerseys, right? Well, they were amazingly, immensely rich. A good example would be Emperor Musa, what is known as Mansa Musa. Mansa means emperor. So Emperor Musa is this devout Sunni Muslim living in the golden age of the Mali Empire in about the 1300s, so close to the end of the period that we are covering. Immensely rich, he's very pious. He takes 60,000 people with him on his pilgrimage to Mecca. 60,000 people are going to walk to Mecca. That's the entirety of Paul Brown Stadium and then some, walking to Mecca. And of course, they're not just walking, they're riding, they're bringing servants along. So they have 12,000 servants to look after 60,000 people. So he's got 72,000 people with him. He has enough money that when he arrives in Cairo for one of the stayovers, he distributes so many alms, he gives away so much gold that he devalues the currency, devalues the value of gold in Egypt for 20 years. He gives away, all told, about 2 tons of gold in Cairo alone. If we were to do the math, that is, let's see, 1,000. So that is roughly $38 million worth of, of gold that he gives away. He then continues on his pilgrimage to Mecca. They do the pilgrimage, and then they come back and they spend just as much money on the way back. So this is an immense amount of money that he is spending. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and fast through these last. All right, sorry about that. We had to kind of fast forward through this because we're running short on time. You can look through this slide. You should be able to stop and pause on the previous slides and look at what's written on those. I apologize, but we have time constraints with this. All right, guys, that is it for this week. See you again next week.